The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
For years and years, I've been telling you one of the biggest obstacles to achieving real nationwide change, a paradigm shift on marijuana, is the scheduling of marijuana as a Schedule I controlled substance at the federal level. As a reminder, according to the DEA, I will show you what they say about this. Schedule I drugs, substances, or chemicals are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Schedule I drugs are the most dangerous drugs of all the drug schedules, with potentially severe psychological or physical dependence. Now, we already know that this definition doesn't fit marijuana. A categorization of Schedule I for marijuana that is shared with heroin and LSD, for example. Now, as a side note, it's questionable whether LSD even belongs in the same category as heroin. Probably a story for a different day. But this is absolutely ludicrous, the idea that marijuana, given that we now know that there are medical uses of it, even if we are still early in the process of determining what they are, the DEA will get involved in considering a rescheduling of marijuana from Schedule I. They say during the first half of 2016. I guess we could say, Louis, this will be a joint decision between the DEA and the government.
Very good. Yes, it's this is a joke. This is a total joke. We have states that have legal recreational marijuana usage,
right?
And the DEA has this this drug scheduled this way. To an outsider, to someone who doesn't live in the United States, this must make absolutely no sense.
Absolutely.
And, I mean, it makes little sense to us.
Smoking anything is bad for your lungs, and we've talked about that. But heroin caused nearly 11,000 overdose deaths in 2014. Marijuana caused none. How can anyone argue that marijuana and heroin should be scheduled the same? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And if this does get rescheduled in the first half of 2016, as the DEA says it will consider doing, it would open the door for expanded research of cannabis's potential for medical applications. It will drastically change, or at least potentially start the change for how marijuana is considered when it comes to incarceration and law enforcement operations. We can't possibly overstate the importance of rescheduling marijuana from a Schedule I drug.
Yeah. I mean, the feds need to back off altogether on this one. It's going to happen. It has to happen. We're caving into international pressure, caving into state pressure. It's going to happen. It's just, this should have happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Earlier this week, I spoke with former Navy chaplain and current state rep Gordon Klingenschmidt about exorcism and whether he still believes in the power of exorcism. And actually, exorcism is making a comeback worldwide. There's a confessed killer in Cape Town who is appealing for an exorcism as part of his sentencing to expel the so-called demonic forces that made him behead his 15-year-old victim and sell the body parts to a traditional healer. Yeah, an exorcism will fix all of those desires right away, Louis. Late last year, staff in a German hotel found a 41-year-old mother beaten to death by her South Korean family in an effort to drive out the devil in some form of exorcism. The Catholic Church in Australia recently admitted to having up to 30 exorcists involved in the so-called March Against Evil. And we can also sort of point to a decree by Pope John Paul II in 2004, where he instructed every Catholic diocese to appoint an exorcist. And we also know this is not just within the Catholic Church, although it's a big problem in the Catholic Church. Pentecostal churches have been adding their version of exorcism to ceremonies. We've seen videos of that.
Yeah, it's... I just don't know who these people are who perform exorcisms and think they're getting results. How does that work? In what situation does someone who's mentally ill or just ill receive an exorcism and then remarkably, get healed? Are they just pretending to be?
It's only in a contrived fantasy world. And as I mentioned, the focus of exorcism is really worldwide is on the Catholic Church and Italian priest Gabriel Amorth, who we've spoken about in the past. He claims to have personally cast out 160,000 demons via exorcism, and the Catholic News Agency in the United States recently published an article describing how to recognize when someone is demon-possessed and may require an exorcism. And even the so-called progressive Pope Francis believes in exorcism. We get emails whenever we talk about this, Lewis, from people who write it and they say, listen, David, the thing about exorcism is it's only to be used in the most extreme cases. It's not to be used as much as so many Catholic dioceses are using it right now. And my response is always, whether you use it a lot or a little, the entire thing is a fantasy world. And people email me and they say, I get that it's crazy because it's being overused so much. No, it's crazy because anybody thinks it's real.
Yeah. People are dying because of this. People are being killed who need medical treatment, real medical treatment, are being killed because exorcisms are being used instead.
Even though it seems that the Catholic Church is doing far more so-called exorcisms than anybody else, the videos of the Pentecostal ones individually strike me as far nuttier than the Catholic ones.
They are all on a level of nuttery that is just unfathomable.
We've known for a very long time, if you've been paying attention, that the real target of the war on drugs is known to be Black Americans. We know this intuitively. We know from so much that has been uncovered that in the wake of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right-wingers wanted some way to keep control and incarcerate Black Americans, and thus was born the so-called war on drugs, which has been, of course, an abortive failure. But we now have a new study from Northwestern University which points to some really interesting racial differences about drug use. According to the study's findings published in the American Journal of Public Health, abuse and dependence on hard drugs, opiates, amphetamine, etc., are less common among delinquent African American youth than among those who are non-Hispanic white. This was an extensive study conducted over a 12-year period. They interviewed over 1,800 youth, about 2/3 male, 1/3 female, between the ages of 10 and 18, who had been detained at Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center in Chicago. Researchers interviewed the participants in the study up to 9 times throughout the course of their 20s, and in that time, the findings revealed that the odds of non-Hispanic white youth using, for example, cocaine were 30 times higher than African Americans, and Hispanic participants trailed slightly behind, showing 20 times the odds of cocaine use compared to their Black American counterparts. When you look, Lewis, at the stereotypes, when you look at the likelihood of being arrested for drug use, when you look at the likelihood of being incarcerated for drug use, disproportionately Black Americans and Hispanics. But when you look at drug use of hard drugs specifically, the use rate among non-Hispanic whites is exponentially higher. Stunning, isn't it? Although maybe not if you've been paying attention for the last 30 years.
Or if you live if you live in this country and you leave the house and you know people.
Right.
I mean, I can speak to this just from life experience and anecdotal evidence that this is 100% accurate.
Unsurprisingly, marijuana was the most commonly used drug across all ethnicities, and as the participants reached their late 20s, alcohol seemed to take over as the substance of choice for abuse. Can we say beyond any doubt whatsoever that the war on drugs has been not only one of the biggest law enforcement and public health failures of the United States of the last 30 years, but also one of the biggest race relations or racially tinged failures of the last 30 years?
Yeah, it's just one of the most pernicious things I can think of.
And the stereotypes that come from these false notions around drug use and drug dealing have real impact. They really impact people's lives. If what we now know, putting together all of the different studies we have about drug use, is that if you are Black in the United States, you are far less likely to be using drugs, but far more likely to be arrested, indicted, prosecuted, and jailed for that disproportionately less likely usage of those drugs. I'm having a hard time thinking of a better example of how, hey, we've got a half black president. Fantastic. Racism is alive and well in the United States.
Yeah. Obama really should have done more to spoken out more about the war on drugs, done more to kind of push for the end.
He has made
of
some
this wonderful-
changes.
Not much. Not much. I mean, he told the government to kind of back off.
Justice Department.
Yeah, he told the Justice Department to kind of back off on enforcing the federal ban on pot.
And
I mean,
releases on nonviolent drug offenders. He has also overseen the climate generally, where we've seen multiple states decriminalize and legalize marijuana. I mean, we can't say he's done nothing. He's done more than Bush.
Well, that wasn't hard to do.
No, it was in almost every aspect, other than blowing up the deficit. President Obama was, or not even that. I mean, the standard with the deficit was a totally different one. George W. Bush exploding it and Barack Obama reducing it. But yes, in many ways, President Bush setting a very low standard for President Obama to achieve. We will take a break. We have such a fantastic show today. And remember, you can get a 33% discount off of membership and a free t-shirt if you sign up for membership at davidpakman.com/spring16.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Louis Sizz. Louis Sizz. Thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. Louis, of course, gets the bonus show hosted by producer Louis, where I am the sidekick, as well as commercial-free audio and video streams of the show. It's really quite an extensive list of member benefits, which you can sample and sign up for at davidpakman.com/membership. 7 years ago this week, we saw some pretty serious regulation of payday loans. Some politicians were trying to outlaw payday loans altogether. Some were trying to legalize them. There was information about what they are and what reasonable interest rates are, sort of swirling, what rates can be charged at a maximum, etc. Over the last 7 years, we have seen the predatory payday loan business become so widespread. There are different rules in different states. Some states don't have specific rules, so it defaults back to the federal rules. This is really a business, Louis, that by its very nature is predatory. When you think about the population that is most likely to seek out a payday loan, meaning a short-term, very high-interest loan meant to sort of bridge the gap between you needing to pay your bills and you getting your next paycheck. And a lot of times the rates are even posted in very big numbers as weekly or monthly rates, which you then have to multiply to figure out what is the effective annual percentage rate that is being paid. It is often comically and tragically high. And this is really a business that I don't consider this to be a business that contributes to the betterment of society, similar to the bail bonds industry. And now when we talked about that, some people, bail bondsmen mostly, emailed in saying, we don't understand how they're helping to get people out of prison and blah, 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 blah. Yes, but they're also lobbying for tougher, or get people out of jail for tougher pretrial detention rules. So this is one of those situations where they are lobbying to create the problem, which they can solve at a profit, much to the detriment often of poor people and non-white people. And I see payday lending the exact same way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's create a system, or not really a system, or let's just try to ensure that people don't need these loans. If you actually want to improve their lives, don't do it by putting them further in debt, right? Just make sure that they don't need payday loans.
There's a discussion going on that I've had with a bunch of people where the David Pakman Show started years ago in Northampton, Massachusetts, which right now is dealing with a lot of empty storefronts. And one friend said, we should really, the landlords should be forced to lower the asking rents to open up a lot of these storefronts to be affordable for more businesses that want to come in. And another friend of mine in a big Facebook discussion responded and said, well, you know what happens when you make retail rent more affordable? The payday lenders come in, and that's not something that you want. And there was a really big discussion about whether payday lenders and also pawn shops are going to sort of take over when you have empty storefronts for a while, lower the prices. And this is a really big discussion, right? Are pawn shops and payday lenders better than having empty storefronts? It is a business. They do pay some taxes. Or are those types of businesses problematic?
I'd rather not see them, to be honest.
There's a real question also about, those types of businesses don't succeed anywhere. They succeed where the financial demographics of the area are sort of conducive to that type of business. But by and large, even in spite of the regulations on payday lending passed 7 years ago, it's an ugly business, and it really takes advantage of way too many people. 6 years ago this week, a Scientologist tried to recruit me to Scientology. I told the story 6 years ago. It's a great story, and I'll retell it quickly. My mom was away on vacation, and she had asked me to check in on the handyman who was doing some repair work at her house. He was going to be painting and using products that she didn't want to be around until they were dried or cured or whatever. So the idea was he'll do the work while she's gone. And I go over there, and this guy was driving around town with a sticker on his work van, which said Rush was right, Rush Limbaugh was right. So I thought he was just generally a right-winger and probably like a conservative Christian type. And he says to me, hey, David, have you ever heard about L Ron Hubbard? And I said to him, assuming that this guy was a right-wing Christian who wanted to ridicule L Ron Hubbard with me, I said, yeah, isn't that the science fiction writer who made up a religion, Scientology? And he says, oh, no, it's funny you mentioned that. A lot of people think that, but actually, L Ron Hubbard is an amazing man. And I've been able to do miracles as a result of what he's taught. And, you're into business, and he is the best business teacher. And at the time I was thinking, you're driving around in a completely dilapidated work van doing, to be quite frank, mediocre work that he was never rehired to do by my mom, also in part because of the Scientology recruitment, of course. So it didn't really make sense to me. But he insisted. He said, I sell the books. And I sold a woman a book in the next town over, and she was just amazed by it. And she was able to do miracles as a result of what I learned. And at this point, I said, I do not want to be branded a suppressive person by this guy. And I just played dumb, like I really didn't know that much about it. And I said, oh, okay, yeah, I'll think about that. I'll let you know if I'm interested in buying a book. A week later, I went to do another check-in on him, and there was a letter in my mom's mailbox. And you know how if you want the mail person to take a letter, you put it vertically. And I saw that there was a letter sticking out, and I open it, and it's from this guy to the Church of Scientology, some kind of a donation or whatever, sending in his money. Long story short, I was able to avoid recruitment, and as far as I know, I was able to avoid being branded as a suppressive person. And I told my mom about it. She was horrified, never hired this guy again.
Yes, I would have probably lost my cool if someone were proselytizing while under my employ in my home.
Right.
I don't know how I would keep my temper in a situation like that.
I only played it cool because, first of all, this guy was huge. I mean, he must have been 300 pounds and 6'6". He was like a lumberjack. And so physically, I didn't want him to get angry with me because of what that might mean. And, my mom was out of the country, and I was sort of responsible for this guy and monitoring him. It just didn't make sense to anger this guy. But yes, he was not hired again. Have not even run into him since ever again. And that's good news for everybody, that's for sure. 3 years ago, a man bought what he believed to be a poodle, and it turned out to be a ferret in Argentina, which is disappointing that this type of fraud would go on in my home country. We've talked about fish fraud in restaurants, people ordering what they think is one type of fish. It's really another type of fish. We've talked about coffee fraud, artisanal coffee being marketed as one thing when it is actually something else. And indeed, we had this story 3 years ago on the show where a man thought he was buying a poodle, and it was a white ferret. And it was a news report which caught the attention. It became a viral story. I remember you were all up in arms about it, Lewis. And it was an ad for toy poodles, which were actually essentially giant weasels. and they were what in Argentina is called a Brazilian rat, a ferret which was given steroids at birth to make it really big, and then sort of groomed to look like it could be a dog, as crazy as it sounds. And they were being sold at $150 per so-called poodle. Quite a racket that they ran. Still one of those weird and funny stories that we talked about.
I just want to know who that sucker is who actually thinks that it's a poodle.
Well, it happened to more than one person, because after the story went viral, another woman came forward and said, "Oh, I thought it was a Chihuahua. There was another ferret which had been groomed to look like a Chihuahua, and I don't know how you do that. Apparently, it's a medical miracle that took place. But yeah, so a number of people were scammed here.
We're probably just dealing with some really dumb people, and you know what? It's not a big deal. $150, a ferret. A ferret can be a very charming and fun pet.
Really? I don't know that much about them.
They're very smart. Yeah.
What can they do? Like, could they do basic math or algebra?
You could probably contract one to get you to the moon.
Really?
Yeah.
Is it one of those things where if you put 1,000 typewriters in a room with 1,000 ferrets, before you know it, they'll write,
The Odyssey.
The Odyssey,
Yeah.
Every time I hear a story related to dogs in Argentina, I'm reminded of the incredible dog dropping problem that plagues the city streets of Buenos Aires. I often describe Buenos Aires, which is where I was born. I love it. One of my favorite places to visit. I describe it as Paris if you were to sort of let it become run down over 15 years in terms of sort of broken sidewalks and spray paint and that type of thing, and let tens of thousands of stray dogs around to use the city as their toilet. But that's sort of, it's a joke because it is a really charming place, and I love going there. But yeah, it is like Paris with a lot of dog droppings.
There are a ton of dog droppings on sidewalks here in Boston too.
I haven't experienced that.
What are you talking about? Right in South Boston, everywhere. People
Really?
let their dogs crap on the sidewalk. Yeah.
I've never noticed that. I mean, yeah, my apartment is smelling really odd lately, but I've not noticed any dog dropping.
You can even see people step in it, of course, and you can see kind of skid marks and there's crap everywhere.
Wow. Well, I've not noticed that, but I will certainly pay closer attention.
I'll make sure to point that out to you next time we're on the street.
By all means. All right, we will take a break. I'm on Facebook. We're all on Facebook together at facebook.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
This week, we're going back to a topic that has really been controversial for a long time, even within progressive circles. It's the topic of genetically modified food. We often hear from some that we just don't really know anything about the health impacts of genetically modified food, and that is actually not true. We really do have a lot of studies done about GMO food. And we're going back to an interview from August of 2013 with George Church, who's a professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School. He is an authority on genetically modified food. This is an interview which angered a lot of people, and it is an interview that pleased a lot of people because they said, David, I am really glad that you're just digging into this issue as opposed to accepting one so-called side's view on genetically modified food. So this is still a topic of much debate. We're going back to August of 2013 for my interview with George Church. Joining me today is George Church. He is professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School, also a director of personalgenomes.org, providing the world's only open access information on human genomic, environmental, and trait data. Professor Church, it's really great to have you on. And in fact, a number of our viewers suggested we talk to you. And the premise, which really was directed by our audience, was some people notice what they characterize as kind of a knee-jerk reaction, particularly on the political left, to be against genetically modified food just on principle. And the suggestion from the audience was talk to somebody like Professor Church and let's actually figure out what scientific data do researchers have about the health effects of genetically modified food that are separate from whether that food is or is not organic, is or is not processed foods. And let's see if we can really drill that part down. So I think that's a good place to start. What research does exist about specifically the health effects of food that has been genetically modified?
So it's definitely not as much research as we would like. There have been a few publications that I know of from around 2004, 2011, 2012. Most of them get some pushback because the sample size is too small, say 10 rather than 60 rodents in a carcinogenesis study on glyphosate and maize, corn. And you could say, and sometimes the responses to the criticisms aren't satisfyingly direct. In other words, they aren't really answering the criticisms. But nevertheless, I think the main thing is we need more research, like almost anything involving foods and drugs, and the FDA, USDA, and so forth. It's probably underfunded, understudied. But there's studies on rodents, there's studies on farm animals that have been fed these foods for a long time. Humans obviously have been in a less controlled manner, less controlled scientifically. But anyway, there's not that much data. And like things where there are high economic stakes, like global warming and so forth, there are going to be people on both sides.
So what would be a fair statement? In other words, in the abundance of caution and speaking only about what we have some data about, are you comfortable at all right now falling on the side that there is a health risk to consuming genetically modified foods? Would you fall more on the side of saying that you think that there is no risk, or simply that it is a question mark?
Maybe none of those three. I would say there is a health risk of eating foods in general. And it's not a one-size-fits-all, meaning that based on the data that I've seen so far, there's much greater health risks in the food supply than the GM part of it. In other words, there are health risks to certain individuals due to diabetes, because there's sucrose in foods more than ever before. There's gluten, there's lactose, there's cholesterol. There are all kinds of things, and I'm very much pro-labeling. Not just labeling for GM, but for various other things. But there are very, very few, if any, cases, medical cases, for GM components to a disease, and there's a lot of cases for these other things.
So I'm interested in one aspect you talked about, which is that you're for labeling, and we are as well on this program. So I'm sure you're somewhat aware, at least, of the campaigns that have been going on in states like California, where GM foods should be labeled, and of course millions of dollars have poured in from very large food companies who are against that. They claim on the grounds merely of cost, not of wanting to really hide anything that may be unhealthy. So I'm curious along those lines, do you think that in the same way that there are corporate interests that don't want GM labeling, are there corporate interests, and you as a researcher might know this, are there corporate interests fighting real research about the health effects of GM foods?
I'm not aware of anyone fighting against doing research. I think there are people that might be critiquing research that's being published or is being designed in a shoddy way. The best time to critique these studies is, of course, before they occur. The best way to make them better studies is to fund them. There may not be a rush to fund something that you already believe to be true. In other words, a non-scientist CEO might not want to fund something that they believe is not an issue, but I don't think they would necessarily block it. But there might be cases of people feeling it's a waste of money.
What would be the ideal way to really test what we're talking about here? In other words, if you could design a study where money was no object, and you could just put together a study to really isolate the genetically modified component of foods as the variable whose effects we're testing, How would you put that together? What would be the ideal way to study that?
Well, the ideal way, putting aside some realities for a moment, would be to study it in human beings. There are plenty of human subject-based research for foods and drugs. It's hard to do foods because people are undisciplined, even if they're paid to participate in a research study. But it could be done, and that would be the best. That would be the best way. I should mention that some of the critique of GM foods is not just the GM part; it's other chemicals that come along with it. But you're right, to just focus in on the GM part. Ideally, you would have a large clinical trial, essentially, with human beings involved.
That's fantastic. So what do you think is going to be the next step in terms of this kind of discussion over GM foods, and what would you like it to be? Putting aside the research that's going to be done, I don't know how much you pay attention to the discussions of GM foods kind of in traditional media, but do you think that there's even a reasonable discussion being had about GM foods in most media, or is really the point being missed altogether?
I tend to think that there is a reasonable discussion. I think there's great value in having a little controversy, a little discussion, because it has the possibility of getting people to spend a little more time thinking about the science. If they think that, especially if they think that's how it's going to be decided in the marketplace, if they think science is going to be part of that, then they will get more up to speed. And anything that brings our population up to speed on science would be great. Because there's many technologies, not just GM foods, where we need to have a very highly educated population. So that would be one good aspect of the current conversation that's going on. A little emotion is not necessarily a harmful thing, but there has to be mixed in, and is, I think, with looking at the data. The problem is there's more heat than light. There's not quite as much data as there should be. I think going forward, the labeling is going to be key, and more, I think people are going to not try to find an umbrella label like these are good foods and these are bad foods. Like everything labeled organic is good, because it's much more fine-grained than that. It's much more personalized. Just like medicine needs to be personalized, your food needs to be as well. So you'll go to the supermarket with, say, your cell phone as a barcode scanner, or you'll just decide before you go there, using your computer to personalize your diet. And I suspect that once people go into detail about the risks of various foods, they'll find that GM is the least of their worries. They should be worrying about cholesterol and cane sugar and pathogenic bacteria that are present on their foods that aren't necessarily been tested.
We've been speaking with George Church. He's professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School. Also check out personalgenomes.org, where Professor Church is the director. Really a pleasure to have you on, sir.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It's that time of the week, the favorite time of the week for many in our audience, and the least favorite time of the week for at least two people I know of specifically who say they hate audience questions, but we persevere because most people do like this segment. We will answer some questions from the audience. You can send these in however your heart desires. Question 1 is from Art. Art said, you recently referenced preferring the so-called authentic Chinese food menus at restaurants. What do you usually order when you eat Chinese? Also, do you like sushi? I realize sushi isn't Chinese, just asking about both. Yeah, I do prefer the authentic Chinese menu when I go to restaurants. Is it actually authentic? I don't know. What I'm saying is I prefer what in American Chinese restaurants is marketed as the so-called authentic Chinese food menu. I've never been to China. I don't know if it's actually authentic.
In many of these restaurants, if you look like me or one looks like you,
right,
they might not even hand you the menu. And some places you have to ask for it. And I find that that is a good sign. in terms of the authenticity of the food, because they are assuming that Americans won't like what's on it.
There's this whole other menu for people who are actually looking. Yeah, I prefer. There's all these great like Chinese greens that are often not on the regular menu that are prepared in different, not just like the standard brown sauce in Chinese restaurants. Those are really, really good. There's one place in particular in Florence, Massachusetts, Great Wall Restaurant, which has a crispy roasted chicken that you would almost think it's been fried, but it's not. It's a roasted chicken, and it's amazing. That may be my favorite dish on any so-called authentic Chinese menu. No clue whatsoever whether that's something you would get in China.
I really enjoy the chicken with chestnuts wherever you can find it. Very hard to find.
Yeah.
But it's one of those really rich, very sweet, salty brown sauce, and not the best thing for you. But I'm a big fan of the duck too, Dave. The duck.
Like the ones you have to order days in advance?
Those are the ones. Yeah.
And what is that barbecue duck, or what's the preparation?
Yeah, well, sometimes barbecue duck, yeah. I mean, Chinese barbecue.
And then how about Taiwanese dim sum? Are you into that?
I'm into every kind of dim sum there is.
Yep. Okay. And then as far as sushi, I never really liked sushi growing up. I just thought, because I was sort of put off by the idea of eating raw fish for a very, very long time. And when I would go to sushi, I would say, yeah, it's vegetables wrapped in rice. I mean, it's not, what's special about this? I would just get the vegetable rolls. But at a certain point, Louis, I made the transition over to, in fact, it may have been when I was at a conference with a bunch of progressive media people, and I went to dinner with Sam Cedar and Cenk Uygur and blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden, there's raw yellowtail with jalapeno on the table, and Cenk's diving in, and Sam Cedar's diving in, and am I going to be the one guy who says, oh, yeah, I don't eat that? And I tried this raw yellowtail, Louis, and I have to tell you, it was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, delicious.
Yep. I'm a big fan of sushi, have been for a long time, although, like Dave, when I was very young, and this is common, the idea of raw fish was repulsive to me. Yes.
I just assumed the texture would be rubbery and off-putting, but it's really not.
No. It's a good piece of fish. It'll just almost melt in your mouth.
The other thing that, I in my head, I have an idea of what foods are the most risky in terms of making you sick. And certainly the seafood world would be within that sort of umbrella of what might make you sick. And raw seafood seems particularly so. But from what I've been told, and I have no idea if I've convinced myself of this or if it's true, supposedly you can tell if you're about to eat bad raw fish because it will smell a particular way, it'll have a particular consistency, so that you're not really at so much risk, and that yes, if you eat bad raw fish, it can be very bad for you. But supposedly, and knock on lucite, I've never actually experienced that so far, and I'm told you can tell. I don't know.
Well, you've had top-notch sushi.
Okay.
And so if you look at it and it arrives on your table and it just doesn't look right.
Yeah.
If something it looks off or smells off, I mean, if you're not really turned off by it, you might still eat it anyway. But it's very clear the difference between something that's very fresh and good and something that may have been sitting around a little while.
Yeah, and although now the thing is, you do want to let the fish, the super fresh, more and more of like the sushi pros say, you want the fish to sit around for a little while. Obviously, they know what they're doing. They're not going to serve you bad fish.
Well, what do we mean by a little while?
A week to 10 days, supposedly.
A week to 10 days?
Yeah.
I have not heard this.
Yeah, it's a whole world out there that I know very, very little about. But in any case, hopefully my nose has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years of Homo sapiens to be able to tell me you really should not eat that and that it won't lead me astray.
Yeah, well, one thing you can always do is when you walk into a restaurant, look at other people's sushi very closely before you order, and then you'll know.
It's perfectly acceptable to go right up to a couple that's eating and just put your face right up and see what the sushi looks like.
You could do it very nicely and say, oh, wow, that looks so good. What is that? Yeah?
Yeah, that's what Lewis does. I've not tried that anyway. Charlotte wrote in. Charlotte said, you both said you have not been to Africa. If you could travel anywhere in Africa, where would you go first? It would be Morocco for me. That's always what I've thought of as the place I would first like to see in Africa.
That's number 2 for me, because number 1 would be, I don't know which national park, but some of those very large national parks.
Like the one in Kenya?
Maybe. Yeah. There are a bunch. And those, to me, that would definitely be number one.
There was a time where Egypt would have been very high on my list. And after speaking to some Egyptian friends and others from the region, they've said for the last many years, it's not a great idea for Jews to go to Egypt, especially if you've been to Israel, and it may not be for several years to come, which is disappointing because it used to be just a fantastic vacation spot for the entire region, including people coming from Israel. But from what I'm told from people who have been there recently, I probably should not have it on my list of places to visit particularly soon. But Morocco seems absolutely fascinating.
Morocco has had a few safety issues lately too, but certainly much better for you than Egypt, at least right now.
I know somebody who was recently in South Africa, and that seems, for other reasons, like a fascinating place to go. For whatever reason, it doesn't sort of attract me in the same way that other places do.
Same here. There's also the
Central African Republic. Of course.
Well, there's that. But what's the mountain called? Kilimanjaro is something that I've kind of always wanted to hike. Maybe that's number 3 for me.
All right, fair enough. Send me your thoughts. I know a lot of people who have gone with groups to very rural parts of Africa, including to Tanzania and different places, and have participated in community building activities, including putting in flush toilets and did all sorts of different things. And something about that is very, very interesting. But, Lewis, I'm not really into camping. And some of what the explanations were as to sort of the adjustments that had to be made for day-to-day life did not strike me as the most appealing, but it seems like it would be an unforgettable experience to do something like that.
I find that you get used to that after a few days.
Yeah.
Because you really have no choice.
When you went camping, you got used to it by just evacuating to a hotel.
I didn't give myself enough time to get used to it.
Yeah.
Is what I did.
Lewis opted instead to go to some 4-star restaurants. Okay, last question today is from Don. Don says, what do you guys hope will be discovered by the year 2030 that would most change the world for the better? That's only 14 years away at this point. Most change the world for the better. Okay, I sort of have 2 thoughts. One, we know we have the resources for nobody on our planet to be hungry. A big change for the better would be to figure out the distribution and resource allocation of that food to eliminate hunger by 2030. Totally doable. Unclear that we have the political will to do it, though, Lewis. That certainly seems to me like one of the best ways to change the country, for the world for the better, rather.
That is a good one. So these are realistic expectations.
Not necessarily.
Right?
Could be
because
anything.
I could come up with some pretty far-fetched ones.
Well, like what, teleportation?
Yeah, exactly.
But would that really change? Would that change the world for the better? What about eradicating disease?
What are you talking about? If you could just teleport from here to Beijing, like in a snap,
you get rid of cars, you get rid of all airplanes, you no longer have any of those fossil fuel emissions. That's the angle you're taking.
That would be. Well, let's just start small. Let's start with as a replacement to air travel.
Oh, okay.
Long distance, let's say.
So, but then why would you drive if you can teleport?
Not every business might be able to afford a teleportation device.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, now you're opening up a whole can of worms. What about eradication of disease, right? I mean, there are so many diseases that we have not been able to really dominate as society. There are still diseases that in first world countries have essentially been eradicated, which are running rampant in less advanced developed countries. It seems that drastic advancements in terms of medicine and the distribution of that medicine would have to be near the top of the list of what would improve the world most drastically.
Yes. So I would like to pick one that, in my opinion, kind of trickles down, and that would be energy. I would like to see some form of clean, renewable, cheap, efficient energy available to the whole world. That's by 2030. Is that doable?
Well, not really. But again, this is all completely
never know.
hypothetical.
Maybe.
This is hypothetical. Yep. So those are my thoughts. I mean, hunger would be very, very, very near the top of the list. Drastic improvements to energy consumption, which would have trickle-down effects, as Lewis says, and then dealing with disease. Somewhere there is where I would like to see a discovery or advancement.
I'm going to add one more.
Please.
And it's a bit more specific. I want to see how we space travel.
Right.
I want to see something change there. I want something that will be more efficient, more powerful. I want to see a change in that type of technology.
I agree with you from a personal curiosity, but to address it the way Don asked, is that the change that in the next 14 years would most change the world for the better?
Well, maybe not right at first.
Yeah.
But if you consider the long term, maybe.
When the sun explodes in several billion years, that'll really pay off.
Well, hey, many experts say that what we do to curb climate change now and emissions, many experts say it's already too late.
Right.
So it might not be due to a supernova that we need to evacuate this planet.
It could be due to self-inflicted wounds, so
Yes.
to speak. All right. Send me your thoughts on that. Great questions this week from Dawn and from Charlotte and from Art, of course. Send them in every Friday afternoon. We will answer 3 questions for you. We have a fantastic bonus show for you today. Sign up and get instant access to the bonus show at davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.